about 5 minutes
Well,
late.
in this case,
So 1 minute late, but too early.
This is Arlington, where more people died.
Yeah, I know.
So that's a twin town.
Let's see how we're doing. How many people are on this?
More than
With us?
No.
A movie?
It was a play.
Yeah.
And then it became.
Let's see, so far only 8 participants. That's not that many.
I've not seen movies. So we read lots of Adams. We listen to them actually.
Okay, looks like the recording is on now.
Marcus is
I'm doing well.
the book Romo.
I'm glad that we don't have to do these
Stephen
interviews.
He's a murder writer, but he's
Yeah, some movie they have one
classicist.
too.
He writes about ancient
Not
Rome.
mile. We've been interviewing candidates.
So I'm gonna be checking with Mark on how far he is in his progress with
Yeah.
it.
Okay.
Easy. No. No, it isn't.
Okay, gang, I see that we have about 9 participants via Zoom, and we may as well start close to on time. So to everyone in Zoom land and everyone here, welcome to the Walter Rodney Seminar. This is our penultimate version of the Walter Rodney Seminar this semester. There'll be just one more coming up next Monday with Cécile Froment. I'll say more about that later. Today, we are delighted and proud to have with us presenting one of Boston University's and the African Studies' own, Josh Castillo, who is amongst other things, a fabulous guy, which is not something that you normally say, but it is true. And he defended his dissertation here just last year. I understand you defended it bravely against all enemies, foreign and domestic, in African history, with a dissertation related to today's topic entitled Lingala Franca, Experiencing and Navigating Language and Political Power in Congo-Zaire, 1965 to 1997. His research focuses on something that we've discussed here in the Rodney Lecture Seminar Series many times, an important subject, the intersection of language with power and politics. And in particular, you're focusing on Central Africa with a particular focus on the largest of all, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He has learned and done research in Congo's 4 national languages, Lingala, Swahili, Kikongo, and Chiluba. And how many of those have you studied here?
2.
Two here at the African Studies Center. And he's conducted multi-sided interdisciplinary historical research across the DRC, which is across a lot, since not all of it's connected by roads even. His articles have appeared in History in Africa and in the International Journal of African Historical Studies, our own periodical, and articles are also under review for the Journal of African History and African Studies Review. Josh has received funding from the Social Science Research Council and from the U.S. Department of Education. He teaches classes here at Boston University on subjects including modern African history, colonialism, I know you have an S on it, colonialisms, interesting, in Africa, catastrophe and memory, I would like to take that course, and language and power in Africa. So we're looking forward to a fascinating discussion, the subject of which is navigating Lingala, language, authoritarianism, and conflict in Congo-Zaire, 65 to 97. Josh, before we turn the microphone over to you, it's our tradition here to go around the room and let people who are here introduce themselves. Our regrets to those on Zoom, we don't let them introduce themselves. It's nothing against them, it's just for practical purposes. So could we start with Jim?
I'm Parker Shipton, professor of anthropology. Not really, but you would know I wouldn't do this for outside. Jim McCann.
You can't get out of it now, I'm sorry.
So you do me. Professor Emeritus of African Studies and History and colleague of our speaker today.
James McCann, origin in the Blue Nile, one of those little rivulets that doesn't count.
Let's stop that now.
Okay. Parker Shipton, anthropology and African studies. Africans are Shipton Parker. I'm cool with that. And my question for you is going to be.
No.
No 4 hours.
I'm Luke. I'm studying East Zulu here with Dr. Molly and studying African Christian history at the Sociology Review. to go to our guest.
Why not?
Hi, Rodney. Research in African studies.
Similar. And I was on your committee, so.
And one of the longest serving directors of the African Study Center.
Dave Golsky, history and African studies.
Zoli Swamali, African languages director here.
Okay. Josh, if you're ready, we'd like to
Mhm.
turn the microphone over to you and hear your fabulous presentation.
Terrific. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for the excellent introduction. And it's really cool to be sort of on this side of the table after hearing many Rodneys over the years and finally being able to give one. So my title today, Navigating Lingala, Language, Authoritarianism, and Conflict in Congo-Zaire, is sort of a bridge between my dissertation and my book project.
Could I interrupt for a second?
Mhm.
Can folks on Zoom hear clearly? It may be that it will help if you to speak more loudly.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm just going to start right in with my script, and then I'll be advancing the slides as I go. When Sylvain Saluseke was growing up in the Swahili-speaking city of Kolwezi, in what was then Zaire in the 1980s and 1990s, he experienced two contrasting reactions when he heard the language Lingala. If he heard Lingala while he was in the street with his friends, then he would run away, as it was likely Zairean soldiers or police looking to harass and extort them. If Saluseke was near a bar or listening to the radio and he heard Lingala, then he would dance to the melodic rhythms of Zaire's iconic rumba music. Saluseke's contrasting physical responses to Lingala, fleeing and dancing, capture the complex and ambiguous ways that Zaireans experienced and navigated Lingala as the language of power in Congo-Zaire under Mobutu's authoritarian regime. Saluseke's responses also speak to the equally complex ideas about Lingala that Congolese people have adopted from this history. His story provides an important starting point as I trace the historical relationship between language and political power in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. As I found throughout my research, in Congo, the languages that you can speak and understand have often been a matter of life and death. Multiple Congolese interviewees recounted situations where speaking Lingala or Congo's other national languages became necessary to survive encounters with soldiers, rebels, or other state agents. Congo, which Mobutu renamed to Zaire from 1971 to 1997, is one of the most linguistically diverse countries in the world, with around 240 languages and 4 regionally distributed national languages, as you can see behind me. Congo has also been the site of some of the most horrific violence of the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, particularly with the Congo Wars from 1996 to 2004, which constituted the deadliest conflict since World War II, leading to as many as 7 million deaths. With such high stakes, it is an especially urgent task to historicize how language has structured Congolese relationships with political power and how it continues to shape experiences of power, identity, and conflict in Eastern Congo, which surpassed Syria in October of 2023 to become the conflict producing the most internally displaced persons or IDPs in the world, around 7 million or 7% of the total population. Before I go into detail, I'd like to start with a brief overview of what I'll be going over today. I'll start with the context, the main arguments and interventions, and my methods, and later I'll review my findings and conclusions. Today, I will be discussing my first book as well as my broader research trajectory. My book is entitled The Language of Power, Navigating Authoritarianism and Conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and it shows how people in Congo have used and adapted language to navigate authoritarian governance amid conflict, from anti-colonial nationalist contestations in 1956 to the assassination of Congolese President Laurent Désiré Kabila in 2001. My title, The Language of Power, refers to a Congolese concept that people use specifically to describe Lingala's status during the regime of Mobutu Sese Seko from 1965 to 1997. And more broadly, people use this term to reference changing languages associated with political power over time. Versions of this phrase are present in French as well as in Congo's 4 national languages, Swahili, Lingala, Kikongo, and Chiluba, as Mark had mentioned. Congo's 4 national languages only received formal recognition in the 2005 constitution, but had informal status as national languages for their respective regions since Leopold II's Congo Free State, and were used during Belgian colonial rule in primary education, local governance, courtrooms, and some religious services. The exact phrasing of language of power shifts based on the speaker and language, but the meaning holds the same. As Congolese historian Jean-Marie Mutamba Makombo explained, it means the language spoken by those who are within the circle of power. From Mutamba's definition, we can see the ambiguity of who might be in the circle of power and how speaking the language of power can bring people in or out of this circle. I will note that we can see how these languages differ also in their borrowing of the French term pouvoir, with the French loanword signifying the term's association with political power and authority. The language of power as a concept thus provides a roadmap in Congo for managing relations with power holders and a lens through which Congolese people have understood complex relationships between language and power. My interviewees would invoke the language of power to explain how political power operated under Mobutu's Mouvement Populaire de la Révolution, or People's Revolutionary Movement, abbreviated as the MPR. For example, Jonathan Kitenge, a farmer in Katanga, explained to me in Katanga Swahili, Muparti palipaswa kujua Lingala sabu ilikuwa lugha ya pouvoir. In the MPR, people needed to speak Lingala, particularly officials, because it was the language of power. So thus we can see how Lingala's status motivated Congolese to learn the language during Mobutu's regime. While my research agenda covers a diverse range of social, cultural, political, and linguistic issues in Central Africa, from the 1950s to the present and maybe even further back, my focus at the core is to emphasize how Congolese people have experienced and navigated political authority by mobilizing and deploying the languages that they learn and speak. Throughout my scholarship, I work to recenter Congolese voices, languages, and agency within an academy from which each of these three elements have been too frequently absent. To access these diverse perspectives, I've developed a new historical approach, as I will discuss, which has the potential to be applied also across geographical and temporal frames. The central argument of my book, as it stands, is that changes in the language of power, from French to Lingala to Swahili, structured Congolese people's relationships to political authority on a national level and in everyday life from 1956 to 2001. By studying changes in Congo's language of power, I first illuminate how Congolese people have navigated political, social, and cultural changes, and second, I explain linguistic change over time in terms of the languages that people speak and how they have perceived these languages. I start my book by showing how French, long established as the official language of Belgian colonial rule, served as Congo's language of power during the quick move to independence from 1956 to 1960. I also show how French maintained its status, but in contested ways, during the First Republic and concurrent Congo crisis from 1960 to 1965. In my talk here, I focus primarily on Mobutu's regime, which followed this period, but I can also expand on these other periods if people are interested. As I argue, Mobutu's seizure of power in the 1965 military coup immediately shifted Congo's language of power to Lingala, which had been established as the language of the Congolese army since early in the colonial period. Mobutu then imposed Lingala nationwide, making the language an informal but pervasive part of the MPR party state, through which he ruled Zaire from its formation in 1967 until the party state's dissolution in 1990. Mobutu instrumentalized Lingala to enforce his rule and also diminish and delegitimize the French-based authority of his First Republic political opponents in Congo, even as Mobutu maintained French as its official language and used it to great effect throughout his rule to gain and maintain support abroad. Mobutu's regime imposed Lingala not through formal language policy, but rather through a kind of language policy by effect, where Mobutu's centralization of power in the capital of Kinshasa, the Lingala-speaking capital, his personalized patrimonial rule, and his regime's violent authoritarian governance increased the importance of learning and knowing Lingala across the country, despite Lingala's lack of official status. The Mobutu regime's lack of formal language policy stemmed not from an explicit plan, but rather actually to the agency and opposition of Zairean linguists, who opposed regime efforts at providing Lingala with official status in 1974 and later on. Lingala remained Zaire's language of power throughout Mobutu's rule, although its status became more complex following the end of single-party rule in 1990. Congo's language of power then shifted to Swahili in 1997, when the AFDL, or Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Zaire, of Congo-Zaire, toppled Mobutu's regime in the First Congo War. Laurent-Désiré Kabila, the new president, renamed Zaire back to Congo and imposed Swahili as his own language of power to strengthen his authority and gain legitimacy after seizing power at the head of a foreign-backed rebel movement. We can understand Congo's complex linguistic ecology and the importance of the four national languages from the fact that neither Lingala for Mobutu nor Swahili for Kabila were their first languages, and yet they both imposed these languages which are not generally associated with specific ethnic groups in Congo as their respective languages of power. Navigating Lingala then represented a central part of many Zairians' experiences of Mobutu's regime. Navigating Lingala contributed to linguistic change in terms of fueling Lingala's nationwide expansion. It also shaped many Zairians' relationships to state power and influenced their experiences of the regime's everyday authoritarianism, also then rebounding into negative language ideologies through which Zairians came, in many cases, to regard Lingala. I contribute to recent scholarship on struggles for decolonization, both political, ideological, and epistemological, by underscoring crucial differences in how Africans experienced and navigated post-colonial as opposed to colonial authority, particularly along gendered and linguistic lines. My book project foregrounds histories from below in terms of linguistic navigation, authoritarianism, and everyday life, in a Congolese scholarship which has at times suffered from a top-down approach, focused mostly on French language documents and political elites. This has left significant room to better understand the ways in which marginalized Congolese, particularly women, have navigated political authority through language over time. My main kind of methodological intervention is in using what I term sociolinguistic history, a new approach that I've developed. Sociolinguistic history works to historicize concepts like linguistic capital, language ideologies, and language practices, drawn especially from linguistic anthropology and sociolinguistics. My approach contributes to broader efforts at decolonizing history as a discipline and decentering monolingual Western-centric perspectives within the academy. Where I apply this approach in DRC, I've heard from colleagues who are also considering or adopting parts of my approach in places like Angola, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and beyond. Another contribution that my project makes is to rethink the social and political process of national identity formation and construction in an extremely linguistically diverse context. This is particularly important in thinking of Congo's multiple cycles of catastrophic violence and civil war, but it also has global implications in thinking about the kind of issues of decolonization and the formation of national identity, and particularly the role which language and linguistic hierarchies have played within post-colonial contestations. Mobutu's rule, which with his extensive, if inconsistent and hypocritical focus on unitary nationalism through Lingala, transformed the political terms of belonging and contestation in Congo, even as it didn't stop the civil war, which came later. I also contribute to scholarship on comparative nationalism in Africa and beyond by studying a Congolese and Zairian model, which does not map onto dominant frameworks, which have emphasized education and literacy as major constructive forces for this kind of identity formation. Thus, my research very much answers the call by scholars of African nationalisms to historicize processes of national identity formation in Africa, particularly beyond the classroom, where Africanist anthropologists and historians have emphasized the crucial role that music has played in these processes through the concept of sonic nationalism applied in Angola, Guinea, Zimbabwe, and elsewhere. We still lack grounded studies beyond the quite public case of Tanzania and with Swahili of how African languages have contributed to the social construction of national identities historically. Just a minute. I benefited from an SSRC IDRF fellowship in 2021, from which I conducted a significant amount of my research in Congo, supplemented by other research trips to Congo and Belgium, and to Stanford's Hoover Institution. As you might imagine, this was heavily shaped by COVID-19, which significantly complicated my research approach and deepened it in some ways. Oral history proved essential for my project due to Lingala's primarily oral and informal status under Mobutu's regime. Language study was an important part of my method, especially after the spring of 2017, when I began volunteering with Congolese refugees coming to Massachusetts, primarily from Eastern Congo. I allowed my refugee friends to influence and inform my research agenda, and I benefited immensely from their contributions. My language learning continued during fieldwork, as in this picture here from 2019, of me with my Chiluba-speaking motorcycle taxi driver, Mulenda. Through several years of formal and informal language study, I gained fluency in Lingala and in multiple Congolese Swahili dialects and in French, as well as advanced proficiency in Kikongo and a strong conversational proficiency in Chiluba. My unique topic and national perspective owed significantly to the ideas and concerns of my Congolese friends. Dialoguing with them, a major stake of my project became to understand both the complex ways in which Congo's national languages have contributed to or been used within conflict, and how these languages, particularly Lingala, have been deployed by soldiers and government agents as part of a nationalist project in Congo, which has often been and continues to be violently exclusionary. My scholarship and learning are thus part of a broader agenda advocating for more inclusive forms of citizenship and belonging in Congo and beyond. As part of my research, I've conducted over 350 interviews with folks range from across Congo's provinces and national language zones, and with a few foreigners who spent substantial time in Congo. I allowed my interviewees to speak in their preferred language among those that I speak. This complicated my research and my note-taking as, for example, when I had to do 4 different language interviews in 4 different languages on a couple of occasions, but it definitely helped my interviewees to sort of feel more comfortable and valued, and I think deepened my research process. My positionality as a mostly white, passing man of white and Filipino descent from the US deeply influenced my research possibilities. Throughout my travels in Congo, I followed advice from Congolese academic mentors to live in Congolese neighborhoods, to gain a deeper understanding of everyday cultural and language practices, which also further strengthened my research process. I often used public transportation to move in and around Congo, although I faced challenges navigating a country the size of Western Europe with a notoriously bad transportation network, numerous active rebel groups, and 4 national language zones. My status as an American who spoke Congo's 4 national languages became especially well known in August of 2021 when I was invited to do an interview in each of the 4 national languages and in French in succession, which aired on Congolese national television after the evening news. My Congolese friends who speak the 4 national languages received no similar invitation. I interviewed Congolese from across professions, regions, social classes, and language backgrounds during multi-sided research that took me to 7 of the former 9 Zairean provinces. I focused on interviewing 3 main groups: political and social actors with connections to or against Mobutu's regime, Congolese academics, and a few foreign academic experts across disciplines, and non-elite Congolese, particularly women, to make up for the massive gender imbalance within these first 2 groups. My interviewees ranged in age from their early 30s to over 100 years old, and in most cases, they provided me with their life histories as well as their memories and thoughts on my project. Alongside my oral histories and ethnographic research, I also conducted extensive archival research in Belgium, Congo, and the US. I went through the extant publicly available archives of Mobutu's MPR party state. My archival research reinforced my appreciation for Lingala's complex position during Mobutu's regime in terms of its relative absence from all regime archives, appearing only occasionally in slogans or quotations from Mobutu. I also interviewed Congolese archivists, learning of multiple phases of destructive violence against national, regional, and local archives across Congo during the 1990s, which destroyed, in fact, a significant amount of the Mobutu regime's once extensive documentary record. Beyond formal archives and oral histories, I also analyzed a range of sources, including songs, slogans, and some graphic novels. When Mobutu had seized power in November of 1965, Lingala was only spoken in the Lingala zone by soldiers and a few traders elsewhere to a limited extent. As Felicien Mbala explained of towns in Chiluba speaking Kasai, Chivwa mangala parchito, tu kese tu commerçant po akuya muchin sansa, kaji wabantu vanso, mangala kavwa tutumbuija chintuto. We did not hear Lingala spoken here. A very few rare traders who traveled to Lingala spoke it, but for the vast majority, Lingala didn't mean anything to us. Where people in Kasai like Mbala had relatively ambivalent views toward Lingala, elsewhere in Swahili-speaking Katanga and Kikongo-speaking Bandundu, people's language ideologies toward Lingala tended to be more negative, owing to the extreme violence that some of these areas suffered during the Congo crisis and in the early years of Mobutu's rule. My interviewees expressed this perspective through the Kikongo term Lingala ikele na bujituve, and the equivalent Swahili version, Lingala aina ishima, in both cases meaning effectively Lingala has no respect. And this then was a reflection of the ways that people saw Lingala deployed within their communities. In the regime's early years,
what the literal translations were.
oh yeah, I put them both together just to be a little more fun. In the regime's early years, they still made gestures toward the other national languages through propaganda. Leading up to the 1970 election, regime officials commissioned Congo's most popular musician, Luambo Franco Macchiadi, to write a song Vote Vert or Vote Green promoting the election. Where the song's title was in French, the content was in Lingala, except for an important spoken section in each of the 4 national languages, where narrators instructed Zairean voters to choose green, the color of Mobutu's party state, as opposed to red, the color of chaos. So this reflected an early awareness within the regime of a need to respect the other national languages and their communities. By the 1984 election, 14 years later, Luambo's election song, the international hit Candidat Nabiso Mobutu, or Our Candidate Mobutu, had lost its other languages and included the Lingala line Loba Monoko Olingi, or speak the language that you want, but reflected what had become Lingala's pervasive presence in popular music and in regime propaganda. Mobutu developed and imposed a hybrid language regime following his military coup, where officials used French for official work and writing and to communicate with the international community, while using Lingala as the primary language to govern the provinces, enact violence, and communicate with the general population. If we think in terms of Frederick Cooper's concept of the gatekeeper state, for which he described Mobutu's Zaire as a quintessential case, Lingala then controlled the inner side of the gate, opening or closing Zaireans' access to the regime with its wealth and power. Thinking beyond the gatekeeper state with its emphasis on borders and external relations, my project also illuminates the inner workings of Mobutu's authoritarian regime as it appeared to Zaireans living under it. Lingala's position in Mobutu's rule was best captured by the MPR's informal slogan, Olinga, Olinga te, Ozarikaka na MP. Whether you like it or not, you belong to the MPR. For Mobutu, using Lingala informally and orally benefited and sustained his dictatorship by creating plausible deniability about the more violent methods of his rule for his Western donors and supporters, including the United States and France, although they didn't necessarily need this. Mobutu not only switched languages to filter his domestic and international audiences, but he also boasted about this to officials in Zaire on several occasions. As one of them recalled, when Mobutu spoke in Lingala, it was meant for Zaireans. When he spoke in French, he would hold back. It was in Lingala that he would say everything. When I interviewed Mobutu's speechwriters and senior advisors, they talked about how he would effectively stick to his scripts and talking points in French, but had free rein when he was speaking in Lingala. Interviewees almost universally described Mobutu as more charismatic, funny, and engaging in Lingala, but also as more violent and threatening. Lingala's informal and oral status under Mobutu's regime rendered the language largely invisible for previous documentary and archivally focused studies of the regime. In Crawford Young and Thomas Turner's comprehensive and path-breaking 500-page study of the regime, they dedicate only one paragraph to Lingala's status. Other political science and historical analyses of the regime are more or less similar. Mobutu's regime minimized Lingala's presence in written records in ways which further enabled his mixed messaging and the sort of structure of his rule. In the multiple volumes of Mobutu's speeches that the regime published, they erased from transcripts his more controversial takes and translated all of his Lingala speeches into French, making no mention that they were doing this. In understanding Lingala's imposition by Mobutu's regime, one important group were the members of the territorial administration, who also oversaw the MPR party state in their respective regions and territories, at levels ranging from the equivalent to an American town or county up to that of a state. Territorial administrators and other MPR officials accessed Mobutu's authority as a regime policy called mutation, or sort of rotation, rotated these officials and their families around the country every few years. Officials reproduced and extended Mobutu's authority, even as they also exercised huge leeway for decision-making and accumulation. Lazare Chipinda, who served as a territorial administrator for most of Mobutu's rule, explained that these administrators effectively became what he called little Mobutus, holding the power of life and death over people in the territories that they oversaw. Proving loyalty through Lingala was especially important for regime officials stationed in oppositional provinces or perceived oppositional provinces like Katanga or Kasai. There and elsewhere, officials performed their status in part through using Lingala, making it central to the power that they could then wield themselves. Political power in Mobutu's system was in part centralized and in part deeply diffused, in ways which have not always been recognized, with officials and other Zaireans being able to improve their relationship to power by adopting Lingala. Where Mobutu's regime mobilized officials and spread Lingala through its policy of mutation, it also immobilized many Zaireans through violence, economic mismanagement, and authoritarian governance. This constructed immobility undermined Zaire's economy and fractured society, but produced new social spaces and circumstances where Lingala could thrive. It also contributed to a sense of national identity tied to the shared experience of Mobutu's dictatorship. Speaking Lingala did not erase the authoritarian violence of this dictatorship, but it could blunt its impact. particularly in parts of the country where Lingala had not been spoken prior to Mobutu's rule. In Katanga, which officials often regarded as the main site of opposition given their 1960 secession and later rebellions, some interviewees like Louise Kabwise, who learned some Lingala, described that knowing this language enabled her to avoid the harassment and extortion of soldiers and party state militias, which her fellow farmers faced at frequent checkpoints. She explained in Swahili, "Kama unasema Lingala, pata kusikia bien. Sabu hapa bengine abakuyua Swahili, panayua tu Lingala. Bali agrese zaidi panabaki, zaidi kama abakuyua Lingala." If you could speak Lingala, the soldiers would get along well with you, because this group did not know Swahili, but they would only speak Lingala. They would assault or beat up other people, particularly women who could not speak Lingala. So Kabwise's testimony then shows that this relationship of using Lingala to navigate regime authority, but also in terms of gender, how women in particular were targeted by regime predation, and thus had to really learn Lingala. If the Mobutu's structures, in terms of the MPR party state, often reinforce Lingala's primacy, some officials also use the language's association with regime predation and Mobutu's authority to undermine centralized control for their benefit or for their constituents. Mobutu's party state had similar characteristics of more authoritarian regimes, more competitive authoritarian regimes, as with provincial and local elections, which happened within a single party framework, but allowed for some space for protest and critique. One example happened in Kikwit, in Kikongo-speaking Bandundu province in the 1977 provincial elections, when a local notable and palm oil business owner named Nicolas Kibari ran against the vice governor of Zaire's central bank, Hikata Ngimakuba, who was also from this region, but had mainly lived in Lingala-speaking Kinshasa, and so in this case remained much closer to power. The regime-aligned candidate Ngimakuba campaigned exclusively in Lingala, which was largely what the MPR's central authorities expected and preached and promoted for candidates to do, in order in part to avoid candidates from building up their own independent power bases. And Ngimakuba cast his opponent Kibari as an ignorant palm oil cutter, or Mokatambila, in Lingala. Kibari refused to speak Lingala, but also sought to counter his opponent's portrayal of him as ignorant, and so he campaigned in French with a Kikongo interpreter, arguing that his Lingala-speaking opponent did not value local culture and perspective sufficiently. Kibari capitalized on still very widespread language ideologies in the region, which associated Lingala with violence, corruption, and immorality. Thus, Kibari launched an indirect critique of Mobutu's dictatorship, but one that resonated deeply with his audience. Kibari won the election and served in the MPR Party Congress for several years. Mobutu was also forced to adopt softer strategies of rule in terms of language policy by opposition from within the country. Regime members attempted to make Lingala Zaire's co-official language with French in 1974, at the height of Mobutu's power, through a purportedly rubber stamp academic conference in Swahili-speaking Lubumbashi. Under the leadership of Education Minister and linguist Nzenge Mbulamoko, a prominent member of Mobutu's Mbandi ethnic group. Many of Zaire's established language scholars, like the novelist and philosopher V.Y. Mudimbe, apparently opposed this plan, but the task of opposing and resisting the measure fell to Zairean graduate students, mainly from the Swahili and Chiluba-speaking regions. This graduate student group, led by Mutombo Hutamukana, then resisted the regime's proposal during the conference at significant risk to their lives. The graduate students argued that elevating Lingala above the other national languages would set a damaging and divisive precedent, destabilizing the country. In doing so, they were also subtly contesting Mobutu's power. While their strategy enraged some regime elites and the regime-controlled Salongo newspaper, Mobutu ultimately concluded that the plan was not worth the trouble, encountering a hard limit to his power and never pressing the matter. This history shows both the agency of Zaireans, linguistic graduate students in this case, and the caution of Mobutu to avoid the level of vehement and organized resistance which discriminatory language policies precipitated elsewhere in Uganda under Idi Amin, and most famously with the imposition of Afrikaans in apartheid South Africa. Thus, we can see the historical contingency of Lingala's informal position within Mobutu's regime, which owed to popular, and in this case, graduate student agency, rather than regime dictates. For Zaireans, navigating Lingala became a matter of life and death in multiple situations. For artisanal diamond miners like Chitunga, who lived on the outskirts of the city of Mbuji-Mayi in the Chiluba zone, learning Lingala became essential during Mobutu's regime to survive encounters with soldiers who patrolled known mining areas. Because artisanal mining went in and out of legality, Mobutu, particularly later in his regime, stopped paying soldiers and instructed them in Lingala that Mondoki ezali tatana mama, your rifle is your father and your mother, meaning that soldiers must effectively provide for themselves with their weapons by extorting civilians. When soldiers caught artisanal miners around their digging sites, they would interrogate them in Lingala. If, as in Jitunga's case, the miner had learned Lingala, then they would, as he said, treat you better, or in Chiluba Bava Kumona Biimpa. This did not mean being let off entirely, as miners would still have to pay a small bribe. But if you did not speak Lingala in these encounters, then you would simply be killed, as Jitunga explained and also witnessed. Regime violence focused particularly on Zairians living outside the law, making knowledge of Lingala especially important for people operating in Zaire's growing grassroots economy, people like smugglers or informal market sellers. This added to Lingala's expansion as Zaire's formal economy declined and then collapsed from 1975 to 1997. I encountered numerous examples of this kind of everyday violence, which could be reduced through knowing Lingala. But soldiers and regime agents grew even more violent during uprisings or rebellions, as with the Shaba Wars in southwestern Katanga in 1977 and 1978. Mobutu's forces initially withdrew in the face of local rebels, forcing Mobutu to get help from his Francophone allies, Morocco in the First Shaba War, and Belgium and France directly in the Second. After the rebels were beaten back, Zairian army soldiers retook the border region of Gilolo and interrogated locals using Lingala as they searched for purported rebels. As Mama Charlotte, who spoke Lingala, explained in Katanga Swahili, "Kama mtu anasema Lingala, panakuacha po, panayua uko ya Kinshasa. Hata kama uko ya hapa, kama unasema Lingala, bien, panayua uko ya ndugu yabo. Kama ukuyua, panayua sema, huyu uko mukeni na panakuua." If someone spoke Lingala, then they would let you live. They knew you were from Kinshasa, even if you were actually from Katanga. If you spoke enough Lingala, then they understood you to be their relative. And if you did not know how to speak it, then they would conclude that you were a foreigner and they would kill you. Lingala, Mobutu's soldiers thus directly practiced this kind of exclusionary nationalism at gunpoint, which, in this kind of system, effectively knowing Lingala at the most extreme cases equated to being Zairian. And this actually was notable and spoke to the success of spreading the language, given that Lingala had not been present at all in this region in 1965. But by 1977, some people like Mama Charlotte, who knew Lingala, could survive this kind of encounter. These violent episodes and stories of them provided further motivation to learn Lingala, even as they also contributed to negative language ideologies that many Zairians came to hold regarding the language. So you see this kind of tension then between this construction of national identity and the societal fracturing that Mobutu's regime oversaw. During the 1980s, structural adjustment imposed by the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, represented a key factor in both the long decline of Zaire's economy and in Lingala's continued expansion. We can see this from the case of Jeff Kony, who was a young university student in 1983 when Mobutu's Prime Minister Congo-Zaire implemented IMF-endorsed changes to Zaire's budget. Like other dictators, Mobutu focused the required cuts on social spending programs to retain his patrimonial authority. Kony, a Kikongo speaker from a lower middle-class family, lost his scholarship overnight to the prestigious University of Lubumbashi after Kengo's decree, and needed to reinvent himself through Zaire's expanding grassroots economy. Kony, like many in his generation, first looked for work connected to his secondary education, but he found little either in his hometown of Kikwit or in the capital of Kinshasa. He then followed a suggestion from a friend and became a Mwana Lunda, or artisanal diamond miner and smuggler, across Zaire's border in Angola. As a Mwana Lunda, Kony needed to master Lingala to navigate Zairian soldiers, authorities, and to communicate with his fellow miners in Angola, as Mobutu's language of power spilled across its borders. Kony managed to survive and profit from his desperate decision, although many of his fellow miners did not. Congolese young people coined a new term, kobukabiki, literally meaning to break your pen, in Lingala to reflect these kind of choices, which changed the calculations and strategies of Zairian young people, as well as their language practices. While some young Zairians chose to leave school for the informal economy, many were forced by financial hardship amid Zaire's worsening crisis. Girls were most likely to have their schooling stopped early due to a combination of cultural norms and the legacy of Belgian colonial rule. Nafisa Tambwe's experience during the 1980s provided a tragic example. As she explained, I had to leave school early because my parents didn't have the money to pay my school fees. After my dad died, my mom tried to scrap together savings from her work as a market seller to send us to school, but she failed because she simply didn't make enough. For Nafisa and many other Zairean girls, difficult family circumstances, exacerbated by the socioeconomic crisis, foreclosed their paths to formal education, and thus to French. Tambwe, like many other Zairean girls in the period, became an informal market seller, a space where understanding Lingala proved essential to her survival and to mitigate insecurity. Lingala's centrality to Mobutu's regime helped explain why in the early 1990s, after popular pressure forced Mobutu to end single-party rule, why this period then represented such a significant rupture in both the apparent and real government authority in Zaire. With the system of mutation ending under popular pressure, Zairean politicians and administrators abandoned Lingala beyond the Lingala zone, as they needed to return to their home provinces and reinvent themselves through local or regional languages and idioms of power. This linguistic shift revealed the always limited control that Mobutu's regime had been able to exert over local authorities, but it also destabilized Zairean society. In many cases, regional politicians used political violence and discourses of autochthony to reestablish their authority, constructing and hardening ethnic divisions through their violence and laying the groundwork for the Congo Wars a few years later. Zairean protesters, especially women, used their knowledge of Lingala and shared experience of Mobutu's dictatorship to launch increasingly direct critiques against Mobutu. Once in 1993, when Mobutu was traveling down the Zaire River in his presidential yacht, he came across a group of women washing clothes on the bank. The women cheered Mobutu and began chanting one of his favorite slogans, Tata aye, nzala esili, meaning Father has come, our hunger has ended. When Mobutu's yacht got closer, the women began cursing Mobutu in Lingala, removing their clothes in powerful gestures of rebuke. This illustrative incident was among many protests by which Zaireans in the 1990s used the national community of practice surrounding Lingala against Mobutu's authority, rolling back his power and contesting his dictatorship. When Laurent Désiré Kabila and the AFDL rebellion overpowered Mobutu's underpaid army and toppled his dictatorship in 1997, newly renamed Congolese needed to adapt once again, as Kabila and his government shifted the language of power to Swahili. In explaining the AFDL's rapid takeover, analysts have primarily pointed to external agency by the rebellion's powerful Rwandan and Ugandan supporters, who contributed both troops and logistics to the movement. But a crucial factor from my interviewees were Zairean young people like Musafiri, particularly from the East, who sought revenge against Mobutu's dictatorship for its destructive influence on their families and lives. Their arguments for their actions focused particularly on Lingala as a symbol of Mobutu's dictatorial oppression. Once Kabila took power in May of 1997, he launched an effort to extend and legitimize his authority by imposing Swahili, making knowledge of the language in many cases a necessary factor to meet with him and gain a position within the regime. Kabila's efforts at imposing Swahili were significantly complicated by the outbreak of the Second Congo War in 1998, which pitted his Rwandan and Ugandan backers, as well as Congolese rebels, against Kabila's new government. This effort became further complicated by his assassination in 2001. As I get to conclusions, overall, my book manuscript, The Language of Power, shows how Mobutu's regime imposed both Lingala and national identity on Congolese in ways which were often violent and exclusionary, and sometimes joyful and cosmopolitan. By navigating Lingala, Congolese stepped into or moved around a new national Lingala-centric community of practice, centered on shared experiences of everyday authoritarianism, creative cultural expression, and shifting strategies of survival. Interrogating how Lingala contributed to Mobutu's regime reveals a complex and multifaceted terrain of power, which Congolese people navigated linguistically in creative and diverse ways. By foregrounding Congolese voices, experiences, and agency across languages and geography, I deepen and complicate our understanding of how power operates linguistically in Central Africa and beyond.
Okay, Dr. Josh Castillo, thank you so much for a fascinating presentation and remarkable research. Really interesting to see. We'll begin with questions here in the room, and then we'll go to Zoom land to see who has questions there. Who would like to start? Oh, Jim McCann was up first.
Thank you, wow. I'd like to extend your methodology and perspective to other places too.
Yeah.
Ethiopia is obviously one close to my heart, but all these issues very much in play, the power, et cetera.
Mhm.
But I have another main
You
question.
Amhara so-and-so.
It is a difference. So think of your interviews in the context about power, language, and cultural expressions taking place within your interviews. What did you eat, drink? What did they serve you? Who did they think you were? And how did that affect what you consumed during those interviews?
That's interesting. Should I just take one at a time?
I think that one has to
Yeah.
be digested
Yes.
first.
To extend the metaphor.
Um,
Anything worth doing is worth
Okay,
overdoing.
so I guess I can just, yeah, so usually I would just drink like some kind of soda or something, or potentially beer if people, I kind of read the room, I guess. Because I was interviewing a range of people, and sometimes like people were very Christian, they might not be as into beer, but yeah, so that would be the main drink, I guess. And I wouldn't really eat anything during interviews. But I got to eat like Congolese food the whole time I was there, which was
But which Congolese food?
well, I mean, so I guess like
They're projecting to you when you're interviewing them,
Yeah.
of course.
I mean the kind of staples of like fufu or like, kind of like ugali and sombe, there's like cassava leaves and just like different fish or chicken. Yeah, a lot of fish. But it was, I mean, I really enjoyed it, but
You always say that's okay.
yeah.
It's good.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Professor Shipton.
I want to go back. Let's go back to the title. Title, Navigating Lingala, Language, Authoritarianism, and Conflict in Congo-Zaire. Conspicuously absent after the word authoritarianism is the serial comma,
Mhm.
which means that we're really talking English rather than American. Is it time for a place that still is called New England to declare independence?
Interesting.
Do you want to take another question before you try to
I
tackle that?
can, I'll say yes. I'll just go with yes on that one, sure. I think we can declare independence. It's been enough time.
I would love to hear a comparison between this fascinating, absolutely fascinating story and the history of English expansion in North America, which involved a lot of force and coercion and residential schools that children were kidnapped and put into and whipped if they spoke their own native group's language, and made to march in like soldiers and stuff like that.
Right.
So are we talking about only a period of history that goes back to 1965, or are we talking about centuries of comparable stories?
Yeah, so I think I'm, as a historian, really stepping into these conversations that people like Falou have been very engaged with, right, within linguistic anthropology and social linguistics. But I think that historians have different tools that they can bring to this kind of analysis, particularly going back over time. And so to my mind, like part of my idea is that the way the academy is structured, particularly with English as this very dominant language, can sometimes minimize the impact of this kind of linguistic imperialism, right? And of the important role that language plays in kind of colonialism and constructing inequality and reinforcing inequality over time. And so in terms of English in North America and this kind of imposition, obviously it's a central part of colonial rule, but I mean, it's something that I'm working on, but I think that as historians, we need to sort of develop more tools and take more seriously how we can read linguistic change and then connect that, right, with political power relations. I mean, it's something that people have very much been doing in linguistic anthropology, I'd say in particular, but I think historians have more to do in pushing this back historically.
Isn't that true of all imperial systems, no matter whether this being one?
Well, I think it's
And
true to
North
different extents, right? So you can take definitely a comparative approach, but I think that that's a really constructive. And so like part of what I'm trying to do then is giving historians language and tools and concepts to be so in my particular context, I have to use different sources because, right, there's not the same kind of written archives. But, somebody working on, I don't know, 18th century, colonial America would have different sources that they could then use if they were more willing to sort of be open to linguistic methods, I guess. But not historical linguistics as much, which has been what people have done, but more these ideas like language ideologies, right? These concepts of how we think about languages and their speakers and how that shifts over time.
Can I ask a second part of my question?
Mhm.
I'm thinking of now from the opposite end of Africa, just being a kind of natural contrarian. If we look at a place like Gambia, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, we have uncentralized polities that have been rather imposed upon by centralized polities, namely by Malinka or Mandinka speakers. And ones like Jola. Now, I've lived among Jola, who are Mandingais, my people. If you like. Over to you.
Watch your back.
Over to you.
He would know.
How to finish that question? I'm not sure how to finish my question, but you see what I'm getting at.
So you're thinking of like kind of, I guess, like language shift, maybe, right?
Yeah.
This idea of language shift and the
Within a
imposition and
lifetime,
impact. So I think there's a lot of variance, right, across post-colonial Africa. Like, I mean, I'm teaching this course on language of power in Africa, and part of what we've been seeing is there's significant variance. But so thinking about like these regional lingua francas, right? Like Mandinka in this case is a language taken up by other people, or Lingala, that's a broader phenomenon, but specific circumstances shift like significant, like are very different in different spaces. So I think there's actually a lot more work to be done to trace this kind of post-colonial social linguistic history, which is very different. And for example, like, I don't know, Angola, right? Angola or Mozambique in spaces where Portuguese has become adopted to a far greater extent than any other African space as a post-colonial European language. Versus, but it's very context specific. And I think it can be like this approach should be applied really across the kind of global south, like across these kind of countries decolonizing, in the sort of 50s to the present. So yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
So will an inevitable conclusion be it varies and it depends and it's about contingencies?
Well, I think that, I mean, I guess I'd say like there's this concept of linguistic, like the language ecology, right? The ecology, the environment of language is going to shift based on the area. And so there's not a single principle or rule that you can apply. But there's a commonality, I would say, in this violent use of language by post-colonial states in constructing nations.
You can stop the screen sharing so there's a few questions coming on Zoom, so I saw some hands raised. You can go, we should
But
go-
I'd like to give Tim one first, if you don't mind.
I wonder if you could talk a little more about language and identity. I was at a conference in 1995 in Uganda where we brought Rodney and Rwandan and Congolese human rights activists together. In their conversations among each other, the Congolese were baffled that the Hutu and Tutsi speak the same language. They said, well, how can you tell each other apart? And at the local level, the Mai Mai groups are all one little linguistic group, and yet they come together and they shifted, but those mean a lot. And so there's the the local languages that still matter at some level, and then you have your regional languages. For people from the outside, one of the things we often say about Congo is it should just be broken apart. That look, they don't even all have a national language. No one in Congo says that. I've never run into anybody in Congo that thinks that's a good idea. They have a strong sense of being Congolese, and so I'm just curious how you see language interact. So you talk a lot about language and power, but how do language and identity work together in Congo?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So you're absolutely right that like I never encountered people who were saying like the Congo should secede or be broken up. And that's notable in that in the 1960s, it was already de facto broken up and also being contested and seceded.
Except people in Katanga State.
Yeah, well,
Katanga separatism.
There is a Katanga separatism, but that's also kind of that's a sort of, I think, a political discourse in a way. But then, okay, so like Congo with all these local languages and then the regional languages and then the national sort of like this kind of complex linguistic hierarchy, I would say that like, people are all like, there's immutable aspects of identity through language that have to be performed. So like even thinking about these local elections, right, and across elections in Congo, I mean, not to only talk about politics, but candidates will need to demonstrate knowledge of a certain language to demonstrate and root themselves in a local community. At the same time as there's mutable parts where you refer to oftentimes speakers of the national languages as like Muswahili, Mongala. You wouldn't identify self, but other people identify you as that. And so there's a shifting nature, I guess, of identity through the way it's performed, where people acknowledge that, but then also act based on it. So it's well known that speaking a certain language will give you an advantage or disadvantage by allowing you to sort of identify with a different group. And so people have these multiple identities that they're able to sort of perform through the languages they speak, even as there's a knowledge at the same time. So like, I mean, I don't know. So even thinking of conflict in the East, right? Rebels, because there's all these, right? There's like 150 or more now rebel groups, and they have to add some Lingala into their Swahili to demonstrate that they're Congolese rebel group and not a foreign one. So the Alliance of Democratic Forces, this ADF in the Northeast, they are distinguished as being Ugandan because they don't have Lingala in their Swahili. And so if locals are sort of vigilante justice finding ADF supporters, they interrogate them, and people have to have some Lingala in their Swahili to be able to demonstrate that they're so there's this layering. I'd say it's kind of a historical layering where this shared experience of living under Mobutu's dictatorship has contributed to creating this national identity where Lingala is always a part of it, even in parts of the country where people rejected the language. So that's I guess that's one way of answering it. That's a great question. I mean, it's something that I'm really thinking about, and it's like, yeah, I guess another way I think about that question is whenever I talk about learning the 4 national languages, the response that I'd always get was like, wow, that's great. In Congo, people would be like, that's great. Now nobody can insult you. There's an idea of like that's like so it's interesting. Like it's seen as clearly as a resource and a benefit, but then there's also this. It's just a complex relationship.
Well, I mean, one of the things implicit in your answer is the idea that just as there are multiple languages, any individual speaks multiple languages, there are multiple identities.
Yeah.
I think a lot of political scientists in particular tend to think of identity as a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
The more you're Congolese, the less you are something else. And in fact, what you're suggesting is people have multiple identities at the same time.
Kind of code switching.
Yeah, exactly. And then power is constructed through that multiple linguistic identity landscape.
So I think should we go to Davy first, and then we'll go to Falu.
Yeah, I'm sure our questions are a bit related still. So thank you very much for.
Could you stop sharing your?
I did, yeah.
You did.
And I have a question maybe that follows up a little bit on Tim's question about the layered languages and the layeredness of the languages. I was very intrigued when I heard the talk, and also when I read your History in Africa article, I think it was, when you talk about the language of power as providing differential access to those in authority, creating a favorable environment for requests, but also that in Congo-Zaire, Lingala as a language of power really was more used orally, conveying oral histories, narratives, stories, oral interaction. It wasn't so much in the archives or written documents. So I'm wondering, particularly now, if we compare it with the Ajami writing system in West Africa, for example, is not a language, but it's a writing system. But also it has historically become sort of a grassroots medium, one could say, in many ways, where local people who do not know Latin script literacy, for example, use the Ajami system, and then it mediates a lot of interactions. So what do you mean exactly when you mean language, when you say language of power? And is there some sort of tension perhaps between the language of power and the language of the grassroots? And what is that tension, in your opinion? Because I'm sure we discussed these things in a Like in East Africa, for example, where I did my field work in Tanzania mostly, there were these village assemblies called baraza, that sort of a very important medium where people were talking to the power, negotiating. But it was also like a grassroots medium. And I'm wondering if you observe something like this also in the places of your field work, and what is the role of this local village assembly for us, this sort of places of negotiation and communication with the power?
Great. Well, thank you. These are really good questions. So I guess thinking about what you're talking about, this kind of a Jami role, right, of like mediating relations. So I think it's definitely like, yeah, Lingala is absolutely, you're absolutely right. It's playing multiple roles and it's being appropriated and reappropriated, right? So like this concept of the language of power, I'm using it because it was kind of how, like, whenever I would ask all these different questions about, okay, well, you know, how did language, you know, function? How did Lingala function in Mobutu? People would be like, well, it was the language of power. It was a kind of reflexive explanation, which then I had to sort of unpack over time. So my attempts at unpacking what that means are drawing from different interviews, and that was kind of what I gleaned, was that it's a perception based. Like, I don't think it's not that, like, it has real limitations, and this concept of Lingala as language of power, as language that allows you to access authority, it's a kind of a narrative about the language. It's a language ideology, and it's limited, and it's not necessarily always true, but it is something that people believe, and it is something that then not dictates but influences their actions in terms of learning, and that's shifted, right? So as the language of power shifted, but at the same time, it being the language of power gives it also, there's like a interesting effect here. So it gives it also a kind of grassroots influence where it can be used to kind of counter that same power. And there's a resonance where, you know, like in some ways the language of power changed. Lingala is no longer, or hasn't had the same association with authority, but is still kind of has this sort of residue of the shared experience of Mobutu's rule, which people have sort of seen more positively over time, actually, with nostalgia. And so, in terms of how people were actually using that, right? This idea, I know, like like we were talking about with the Baraza in East Africa. So it was the language that basically all officials would use whenever they had sort of any kind of public assembly. That was the idea. Like, it's not to say it was always used, but the idea was that this was the language you would use. You would not use French. You would use Lingala. And part of that was because, right, officials would generally be from outside their region, but people then so they could also kind of negotiate authority through the language in sort of staged ways, maybe, but publicly, right? It wouldn't necessarily enable people to actually, like, speaking Lingala wouldn't actually enable you to contest the authority of the regime, but so like whenever like major officials would be giving a rally or something, they would always give time for people to kind of launch critiques. They'd have to be very strategic about how they did that, but they could. And so there was this sort of negotiation space, which was, I guess, part of the regime, but it was limited. Let me see. But yeah, I guess this language of power concept, I've been thinking about it more because I was recently, I had Abel Jassi Amadou visited our class and talked about his book, and he talks about this idea of the language of power used very differently in Cabo Verde, where it's Portuguese is seen as the language of power, and French maintained its status as official language. So I think actually, so that's where I guess I see the differentiation in these posts. Like, I think that maybe I'm just a historian, but like,
Don't apologize.
yeah,
Come on.
no, I mean, there's so much significant difference across context in how people are reading this relationship of language and power. And so the concept of the language of power is specific to Congo ethnographically, I would say, to perceptions of how people see language, like mediating and enabling access to authority, I guess. So like, I don't mean to ramble too much, but this idea of linguistic capital, right, is something that I'm working with now. It's something that Bourdieu developed, and it's been kind of, in some ways, used broadly, but not deeply. And so I'm trying to do work to kind of situate that concept in term historically, so that the kind of linguistic capital that like speaking a language as giving you access to sort of other resources that shifts over time in relation to the kind of how people in sort of linguistic marketplaces, the ways that people perceive the value of that language. And so like in talking about my case, when I talk about the 1990s and the end of single party rule, the linguistic capital or value of Lingala in some ways declined as a political language, but then increased in relation to the collapse of the formal economy. So you can do that kind of tracing linguistic capital and thinking of languages of power is something that you can do anywhere, I guess, with English or other languages. And it's something that, I mean, sociolinguists have recently been working with in East Asia, but anyway. So sorry about that kind of long-winded attempt at multiple answers, but
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we turn to Lingala?
Thank you, Josh. This is great presentation. It's very nice to see that language is now being used in historiography. It makes me think about David Shobron.
Yeah.
You know, he's done some very good work in this area. And first question then is how do your work overlap with his, and how do you enhance his work, his limitations? Number two, you use the question of community of practice. Traditionally, the concept is very useful for understanding group identity of small ones, tied to one activity, going to church or sharing one particular activity. I like the idea that you're using it, and so I'm wondering how are you expanding this concept to be able to accommodate, you know, the realities that you apply on the ground. And last another question, you mentioned Bourdieu, again, the same framework. Bourdieu's linguistic market economy was created within the context of Europe, and so the values attached to his language very different from the fluidity of ethnic groups that Steve was talking about. So then that would probably require some modification. How you adapt and expand that. And finally, I like the idea that you gave. I think it would be very unique to look into as you transform the different things into your book. The forensic linguistic aspects of loanwords that we use to identify friend and foe. That's very interesting. We have similar in the book of the Judges, the Hebrew Bible. You have shibboleth test that was used to determine who was foe and friend, pronouncing the word shibboleth. Those who said shibboleth were killed, about 40,000 men were killed. The same process is now being used in, you know, forensic linguistic and language analysis. I think that's expanding that in your project and drawing it, getting the literature would be really, really good. Finally, how does language scape, the concept of language scape, play into your work, and how public representations of language in signs, road signs, you know, public activities, how does that, you know, fit into the power of dynamics? But this is very good presentation. I get very good ideas for this trying to help you create a blockbuster book.
These are terrific questions, and I definitely cannot do justice to them in this setting, but I will be working with them because I think these are bigger questions that I have to think more about. Okay, so starting out in terms of Schönbrunn and sort of historical linguistics. So in terms of the interactions, I think in limitations, right? I think that part of what I guess a limitation that I've seen with historical linguistics is that you're sort of working with dictionaries, not people as much, right? It's not as directly engaging with people, and sort of by constructing speech communities in the past, you're not necessarily directly engaging them in the present. And so, like, as seeing this sort of fluidity of language practice, I think there's a question or limitation of how much, how deeply you can draw from that, I guess, which is, I mean, something, and this isn't my critique, but something people have critiqued it. But so thinking of sociolinguistic history in Africa and sort of drawing from historical linguistics, I would say it's like where the archive of historical linguistics is words and sort of language shift, word shift over time. My archive is more language ideologies and language practices. So trying to trace and understand how communities language usage changes over time as a sensitive index of social and political cultural change. So that's something that linguistic anthropologists have worked with, like Jan Blomer especially, but has not been taken up by historians the way that it can be. So like for those interviews of looking at people in the 60s and tracing it over time, that's one kind of expansion, I guess I would say, of this historical engagement with language that people like Schoenbrunn have done. In terms of communities of practice, you're right that it's usually used for smaller groups. I think it's been a way for me of trying to conceive of this almost like it's limited in terms of being a national community of practice, because there's a vast spectrum of how much or how little Lingala people learned, but it was a way to sort of interact with the state. It was this mediation of people's experiences under Mobutu's regime. And so I think it's just so actually Akino Gundaran, BU alum, yeah, he's worked with this concept to think of the construction of kind of Yoruba identity over time. And so I'm kind of drawing from his engagement with that concept. But also I think it's as a concept of communities of practice, it speaks to the kind of multiplicity of languages that people speak, but the ways that they come together through a single language. In this case, Lingala, not ethically associated, but then having all these other associations. So in terms of adapting and expanding Bourdieu, ironically, so Bourdieu talks about language in the French context and then sort of extrapolates. And a critique that people have launched, right, is he has this idea that like it's linguistic condescension, speaking a language seen as less prestigious as like, so in his analysis, Mobutu using Lingala is actually linguistic condescension. He's benefiting as a higher status person from using a lower status language. But I don't think that's actually how people experience and see it. And so I'm sort of drawing from how people perceive and talk about this use of language, and in a way, right, and intervening in Congolese historiography. Because within Congo, the whole emphasis was on Patrice Lumumba as being the revolutionary figure, transforming Congolese politics and then being tragically assassinated. So it's not that I want to contest Lumumba's status, but Lumumba was an évolué. He was an elite who almost all of a lot of his public politics was in French. And Mobutu popularized politics. He allowed more people to participate in the political process by bringing in Lingala. And so contributing to he was formative in sort of constructing political culture in Congo. So that's a, let me see. So in terms of forensic linguistics, that's actually a great idea. I hadn't thought about that, but that is a great way of framing and thinking about, because that's effectively part of what I'm trying to do, is that in Congo, you have all of these conflicts, both in the Congo crisis and in the Congo wars, and language is rarely analyzed in what role that's playing. So I'm sort of limiting myself and looking at the national languages, which have always been present within these conflicts in complex ways. But you could also expand on that. And like Tim's saying, like thinking more about these local, there's a lot of sort of, I would say linguistic tools that you could use to better understand and kind of combat conflict within Congo and elsewhere. So, and I think forensic linguistics is another, no, very much. That sounds great. Yes. Thank you so much for those excellent questions.
Okay, thanks very much. No, I'd like to, if you don't mind,
I
want to give someone a chance from Zoom, and then we'll come back. I think Tim Waskell has a question. So Tim, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks a lot. This, Josh, is a fantastic series of thoughts. And like I've been working in multilingual parts of West Africa, which I don't master the languages of, but I watch the way people use language. And I've been quite struck by the ways in which language is used inter-ethnically to mark power in different kinds of ways, and also to insult, but also the fact that language carries with it, especially if you're trying to speak one that's not your own native, the question of language, accent and inflection. You can tell immediately that they understand between two languages that they're speaking, who's the native speaker and who isn't. And that in itself has a power that I wondered if you mapped as well in the Congo. In other words, not just speaking another language, but the effort to speak the other language is itself sometimes problematic. and can either have a valence of positive or negative in some cases. In any case, that multilinguistic thing is important in the contemporary world, but in the historic case, it's even more important in a sense with the weight of the slave trade, because the role of the linguist, that is the person who interprets across boundaries, is absolutely crucial. And the use of language on both sides of, or let's say both sides, but all five sides of an encounter is crucial. And I just wondered if you ran into that sort of inter-ethnic, or I don't know what to call it, interlinguistic power kinds of statements, since you're so sensitive to all of these things. Thank you so much for such a great presentation.
Yeah, so thanks so much for this question. So okay, so there's a few ways to answer this, I guess, but in terms of like the importance of accent and being a native speaker, one actually important part of Mobutu's regime, a sort of positive element, was that by imposing Lingala and sort of making it a kind of cosmopolitan language, in Mobutu's system, people didn't have to be, like, very few people were native speakers. And so officials who might speak what people perceive to be as not great Lingala could still sort of benefit and speak the language. But the standards of actually speaking Lingala in Congolese political culture have increased significantly. And so since Mobutu, there's not that same kind of national cosmopolitanism in terms of how people perceive Lingala. And so that means like people who are non-native speakers are sort of judged more harshly now versus under Mobutu's more cosmopolitan system. And people talk about this in terms of ethnicity, or they talk about tribalism. But there's this idea that the sort of boundaries of ethno-regional identity have hardened. And that started really in the 1990s, especially, but it's continued to the present. And so that's constructed a more brittle political community, I guess, where everyone, like Lingala might still have this status, but it doesn't sort of, I don't know, there's limitations to what actually speaking Lingala can do for people or for politicians, or yeah. But so the other thing in terms of like interpretation and the trade of enslaved persons, I'm blanking on his name, but there's actually a great history, Journal of African History article from a couple of years ago by a Brazilian scholar looking at, you could look at, I think it's from 2019, looking at the Congo coast, actually, in Angola, and looking at the role of interpreters with a slave ship in Brazil, and looking at sort of how constructing linguistic identity. So I guess there's actually good work, and he's drawing from linguistic anthropology. So there is good work on that in looking at kind of, yeah, that deeper history, although it's not what I directly engage with.
Interesting. Yes, sir.
In order to cut the orange from a different direction, this is also wonderful. Let's talk for a moment about the language of dress. Now, as you know, Mobutu had real problems with neckties. Anybody who wore a necktie was likely to be exterminated. But on the other extreme, he also had a thing about leopard skins as a language, as a dress of power.
Yeah.
And not everybody got to wear that.
Mm-hmm.
You could risk assassination if at the one end you wore a necktie like the French, or at the other end you wore a leopard skin cap like Mobutu. Is this not true? Is there a kind of exclusionary principle as well as an inclusive one going on opposite?
Yeah, I think there definitely is. And so dress was really important within this kind of construction of national identity and community.
Yeah.
And I would say,
we saw the throne too.
So yeah, exactly. Like I had to have that in there. So Mobutu was kind of picking and choosing in a way from this kind of melange or mixture of different symbols that could kind of convey national identity. And that's something that, like, that's true across this kind of decolonizing world, I would say.
Oh, absolutely. Kenyatta carried the fly whisk, which was.
But and so is food as an expression of identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so but dress in particular played a very important role, and kind of continues to, right, in Congo, I would say, in Central Africa, but and so yeah, that was, I think, central even I mean, the idea of the leopard. It wasn't just the leopard skin. There's the Mobutu was in Koi Mobadi in Lingala. So he's the leopard man.
Yeah.
That he could at night transform. And that was and so he was drawing on multiple kind of idioms of power. Right. And yeah, exactly. And all of those things were people really believed that. And even he had his leopards. Yes, exactly. Right. Right. The name itself. But the other thing that I think is underemphasized is that this process was sort of contingent. Changing the names was an essential part of the Zairean experience, but that actually only occurred because he read in a Belgian Catholic daily. Somebody was like, wow, Mobutu's banning the suit and all this. He might as well get rid of everyone's Christian names. As an irony, they wrote this, and then Mobutu's like, actually, we're going to do that. And then, so that was a very, that was a kind of spur of the moment decision by Mobutu to change everyone's names. But then the name that he took on, right? So, and everyone had to then change their names, right? And people would sometimes do that strategically, right? They people that were aligned with the regime would choose names often that would that might kind of make them look more positive. So it might be like, I don't know, like Nzenga Mbulamoko, right? Mbulamoko, his name that he took on, I think, was like strong man, because he was in Bandi as well. So he took on this name which would like connect him to Mobutu. So there was a whole strategic process of naming and then of shifting names, because sometimes people would, if they were, for example, Kasayan, people in the Kasai region who were in Katanga, there was a lot of regional tensions. And so as they shifted their names, they would also change the pronunciation. So people would think that they were then from Katanga. So there's this whole, I don't know, there's a lot more history, I guess, with this language and naming and strategies that people were using. But I think that's where I think about this idea of navigating language, right? That's what people are always doing. And even in an authoritarian conflict context, even in horrific civil war, people are always kind of exerting agency, even if it's constrained, through language. So that's kind of my overall,
Josh, you could do this for the Philippines also.
Yes, I've been working a lot recently with Southeast Asia, right? Thinking of the Philippines, thinking of Indonesia. There's actually a lot of kind of really fruitful comparisons beyond Africa to think particularly with experiences of colonization, decolonization, and language. And so that's part of what I'm working on for my book project.
Shocking experiences in Cambodia.
Yeah.
Where people who spoke French might be subject to extermination.
Yes.
By leaders who had PhDs from France.
Yeah, no, that's right. So that's actually a great point, right? So I think there are so many different contexts that sometimes we can be siloed, right? Even regionally siloed, disciplinarily siloed. But I think, but there's a lot of fruitful comparisons that aren't drawn from in thinking with Southeast Asia and Africa. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions coming from Zoom land? We actually just